So in larger scale English proficiency tests like TOEFL, IBT, or IELTS test, or a PTE test, actually the listening test, the listening section is audio mediated rather than video mediated. However, some researchers argue for including the videos in second language listening test because it is authentic. Actually, we can see that in a real language classroom, the teachers will sometimes will use the videos to instruct the learners, and sometimes the video are used in classroom activities. So the rationale for use of videos in second language listening test is that this kind of test will simulate the target language use domain or TLU domain. However, some other scholars argue against this kind of argument because they think that there is a lack of applicable theoretical framework to, about the combinatory of visual stimuli and oral input. So we cannot know what kind of construct this task is really measuring. For example, when you use videos in a listening test, what are we really measure? Is it we are measure the listening, or we are measuring the reading ability? So so there is it is necessary for us to investigate the effects of videos in second language listening test. Past literature investigating the effects of videos in listening tests generate mixed results. For example, Brett and Lansnov have found that the videos will improve the listener's listening comprehension. However, Ginder, Lanzi, etc., these kind of scholars have found that the videos have a negative impact on the listening performance on the part of the test takers, because the listening test, because the visuals or the videos in the test will distract their attention from the oral input.
And sorry, also, may I interrupt? Yeah, your slide is okay. In the first slide.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is it still in the first slide?
Yeah.
So is it okay if I use this kind of format?
Oh yes. Okay. Please.
So just now I'm trying to say that actually some scholars argue for the inclusion of videos in second language listening test. However, other scholars argue against the inclusion of videos. And past literature showed a mixed result. Some scholars argued that have found that the positive effect of videos on the listener performance, and some scholars have found a negative influence. And also, scholars like Lenovo 2018 have found it makes no difference whether the listening test include videos or not. So despite these heterogeneous conclusion, we can find that actually these findings lacks consistency. They did not have a consensus regarding the effects of videos in second language listening performance. So the current study will investigate the effects of videos on listening performance via meta-analysis. Actually, meta-analysis is totally different from the traditional narrative review, literature review. In a narrative literature review, it just summarizes qualitative studies, and this kind of review doesn't have predefined research questions or defined search strategies. They are not systematic. However, in the meta-analysis, what we just focused is on quantitative results or quantitative studies. It is systematic because we have to follow a set of rules so that we can conduct the studies. And for the current study, for the meta-analysis, I will use Cohen's D. This is an indicator to reflect the effect sizes of videos on second language listening comprehension. Now here comes the method part. The data was retrieved on November 2020. I retrieved the data from 3 databases, that is Scopus, Web of Science, and CNKI. And the period for these literatures is from 1990 to 2020. And 2 sets of keywords were used to search the literatures. The first one is video-related keywords, including video, film, media, visual, audiovisual, etc. And the second set of keywords are listening assessment-related keywords, including task listening, assess listening, listening assessment, etc. So I combined these 2 sets of keywords to search the literatures on Scopus, Web of Science, and CNKI. Now here's the initial search result. After the initial search, there remains 1,406 publications. And then with the help of an assistant, we screened out those that were not related to listening and linguistic or language. We screened out these kind of unrelated publications. So there remained 856 publications. And then we applied our inclusion and exclusion criteria. The first criteria is that studies that used experimental and quasi-experimental research methods were included in the current study, but review studies and qualitative research were excluded because in meta-analysis, we have to use quantitative data to reflect the effect size of the effect of videos. And the second criteria is that the dependent variable should be listening performance measured by standardized tests or self-constructed tests. Studies whose results were related to other variables were excluded. For example, if a study investigated the emotion of the listeners, this kind of study will be excluded. And the third criteria is that if an article included the use of video in language instruction, but the test's experimental design did not incorporate videos, then the article was excluded. Because the primary purpose is to compare the effects of audio-mediated listening test with video-mediated listening test to identify the effects of video-mediated listening tests. The fourth criteria is that if both groups used videos and only the features of the videos was compared, then the studies was excluded. It means that we have to use those literature that compare the effect of audio and video, not comparing video with another kind of video listening test. And the last criteria is that sufficient data were identified to calculate effect sizes such as sample size, standard deviation, p-value, t-value, or f-value, or odds ratio, etc. Because in meta-analysis, we have to use quantitative data to generate the effect size. After applying these criteria, there remained 33 papers that were suitable for these current studies. So later we will use the 33 papers to generate the effect size. And because these studies are different from each other in one way or another, so with the help of an assistant, we coded some variables of the 33 literatures by using Buck 2001's framework on listening assessment. The first variable we coded is about listening methods. It means that whether these whether the past literatures in their listening tests, they use computer-assisted listening test or pen and paper assisted pen and paper listening test. Note-taking means that whether the listening test in the previous studies allow for note-taking. Expected response means that whether the previous studies in their listening tasks, whether the listeners will answer the test items via multiple choice question or or they have to constructed their own response to the test items. And test formats means that test formats can be categorized into while listening performance and post-listening performance tests. It means that whether the listeners can answer the test items while they were listening, or whether they have to answer the test items only after the listening, or after they listen the oral input. Times for listening means that whether the previous study allow for how many times for listening on the part of the test takers. For example, one time or multiple hearing. Question preview means that whether the listening tests allow the listeners to preview the questions or not. And the last one, the last moderator variable is related to video types. Video types can be categorized into content videos, context videos, or mixed videos. Context video means that when taking the listening tests, the test takers can watch the body language or the lips from the speaker, or watch the context, for example, the environments where the speakers communicate their ideas. Content videos means that the content in the videos corresponded with the content of the listening material. So we coded these variables to see whether these variables will affect the effect size of the to see whether these variables will influence the outcomes. And then we imported the data by this via this software called comprehensive meta-analysis, and you can find this software online. About the missing data, if we find some missing data, we used two kinds of methods to address this problem. The first method is to email to the authors to request for data, and the second is to made an educated guess. That is an inference. Now here comes the result. We can see that the coherence D, or the effect size, the total effect size of videos is 0.601. According to Cooper, 0.6 means there is a medium effect size of the videos on listening performance of the test takers. The I square equals to 63.412. This figure means that in all the previous literature, all the variance, there are 63.41% of variance are due to true variance. It means that these kind of studies are different from each other to a very large extent. So why they are different from each other? So next we did the moderator analysis. So actually I have already talked about the moderators. The three moderators, we can see that the delivery methods, note-taking, and expected response did not have significant influence on the effect sizes, on the total effect sizes, because the p-value is larger than 0.05. The p-value is large. So we can see that the three moderators do not influence the test result. However, these moderator variables will have significant influence on the test result. They are test formats, time for listening, question preview, and video types. For example, the test formats will significantly affect the test result of the listeners. While listening test, the listeners perform better than those did in post-listening performance. And if the listeners are allowed for multiple hearing, they can hear many times of the listening material. They will perform better than those who are allowed only one hearing. And if the listeners are allowed for a question preview, they will perform better than those without question preview. And content videos will facilitate the comprehension or understanding of the listening material for the listeners or for the test takers. And after we detected the effect size, and then we detected the publication bias. Publication bias means if the literatures we have already searched, if there are any unpublished studies that might be present. About publication bias, we used this figure, classic fail-safe N. Classic fail-safe N is actually the minimum number of undetected negative studies that would be needed to change the conclusions of the meta-analysis. A large fail-safe N means there is a lack of publication bias. So we can see that the figure is 1,342. This is a rather big statistic. So in the current meta-analysis, we did not find publication bias. And here's the conclusion. The first conclusion is that the 4 moderator variables will significantly influence the performance of the test taker. They include test formats, multiple hearing, question preview, and content videos. And the total effect size of videos on listening performance is medium. The conclusion will is significant for the test developers because when they are designing the listening test, whether in a classroom or whether for large scale listening test, they have to take these kind of considerations into account, and they have to think about whether to use the videos in their listening test. And here is the references. If you have any question, please feel free to ask me by typing in the chat box or just email me. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Roland, for your sharing. Very inspiring speech. Time for question. Is there any question? Thank you again. If you have any question, please feel free to contact her by email or WeChat. Thank you. Okay, now let's